Iran's supreme leader warns future U.S. attack could trigger strikes on American bases in the Middle East. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth defends strikes on Iran and criticizes media coverage of nuclear raid intelligence. And Pope Leo describes the Middle East conflicts as raging with diabolical intensity, urging respect for international law. Iran's supreme leader has warned that any future U.S. attack could trigger strikes on American military bases in the Middle East. In his first televised remarks since the Iran-Israel ceasefire, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said Iran had already hit the largest U.S. base in Qatar and could repeat such actions if needed. He described it as a hard slap to America and warned that Iran holds the capability to target major U.S. sites across the region. His pre-recorded message had comments aired Thursday, delivered from an undisclosed location beside the Iranian flag and a portrait of the former leader, Ruhollah Khomeini. For his part, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he will continue to coordinate closely with U.S. President Donald Trump following the ceasefire with Iran. In a post shared shortly after Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, delivered his first speech since the truce, Netanyahu said he remains committed to working with Trump to, quote, defeat their common enemies, free hostages, and quickly expand the circles of peace. The message was accompanied by a photo of Netanyahu and Trump holding hands, underscoring the close ties between the two leaders amid ongoing regional tensions. Iran has taken a major step towards severing ties with the UN nuclear watchdog. The Guardian Council has approved a bill passed by Parliament to suspend cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. The legislation, endorsed by a strong majority of 221 out of 290 lawmakers, paves the way for Iran to halt inspections and limit access to its nuclear facilities. This move comes amid heightened tensions following Israel's air campaign targeting Iranian nuclear sites and the IAEA's recent resolution accusing Tehran of breaching its non-proliferation commitments. The bill now awaits final enforcement procedures by Iran's Supreme National Security Council. Meanwhile, Russia has urged Iran not to sever ties with the UN nuclear watchdog following a major escalation in the region. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow wants Tehran to continue its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. His remarks follow the Iranian parliament's approval of a bill to suspend that cooperation in response to joint US and Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. The bill still requires final ratification by Iran's Supreme National Security Council. Moscow, a key ally of Tehran, has expressed concern over the fallout from halting inspections and called for diplomatic engagement to prevent further escalation. British newspaper Financial Times reported that initial intelligence assessments presented to European governments indicate that Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium remains largely intact following the US strikes on its main nuclear sites. Two officials told the newspaper that intelligence suggests Iranian stockpiles amounting to 408 kilograms of uranium enriched to near weapons-grade levels was not concentrated at Fordow, one of its two main enrichment sites, at the time. of last weekend's attack. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth defended the American strikes on Iran and sharply criticized media coverage of the initial intelligence assessment regarding the impact of the raids on Iranian nuclear sites. He criticized media reports that cited a preliminary U.S. intelligence assessment suggesting that the strike did not eliminate key components of Iran's nuclear program, but merely disrupted its operations for a few months. Tensions in the Middle East have escalated dramatically since June 13, 2025, following the outbreak of a direct and dangerous conflict between Iran and Israel. What began with high-profile assassinations and targeted strikes has rapidly spiraled into a multi-front confrontation involving major regional and global powers. Here's a timeline of the key developments in this unfolding crisis with our colleague,
the Iranian-Israeli conflict erupted on June 13, 2025, marked by high-profile assassinations, attacks on nuclear sites, and waves of Iranian drone and missile strikes. The escalation triggered regional turmoil and raised fears of a potential nuclear confrontation. Backed by covert Mossad operations, the assault prompted Iran to launch around 100 drones and missiles, causing major damage. The UN condemned the escalation, and the IAEA warned of serious risks from attacks on nuclear sites. By June 14, Israel intensified its offensive, striking Iran's defense ministry and Tehran's airport. In response, Iran launched attacks on Tel Aviv and Haifa. As a response to the military escalation, Iran announced the suspension of nuclear talks with the United States. Israel's unprovoked attacks on Iran was condemned by numerous nations, including Russia, China, Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. While G7 nations and several other European states voiced support to Israel, others adopted a more neutral stance, urging de-escalation. On June 16, Iranian missiles hit Tel Aviv and Haifa, killing 8 and injuring over 100. Israel said it intercepted most and destroyed a third of Iran's launchers. Iran later announced arrests linked to Israeli intelligence. The next wave of attacks came on June 17, when Iran claimed it had successfully struck Israel intelligence facilities, including Mossad Center. In response to the escalation, 21 Arab and Muslim nations endorsed an Egyptian-led collective statement condemning Israel's aggression against Iran. On June 18, Israel hit Iran's Hujayr missile complex and centrifuge sites in Tehran and Karaj, strikes later confirmed by the IAEA. By June 19, it targeted Natanz and Arak, with the military ordered on June 20 to prepare for a prolonged campaign. In a dramatic escalation, President Trump announced on June 21st the U.S. bombers struck 3 major Iranian nuclear sites, claiming the operation had obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities. By June 22, the U.S. clarified its goals. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the mission targeted Iran's nuclear program, not regime change. Officials called it a one-time strike, warning of strong retaliation if Iran attacks U.S. targets. On June 23, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Putin condemned the U.S. strikes as unjustified aggression, pledged diplomatic and humanitarian support, and offered to mediate, but withheld any military commitment. At the June 23 NATO summit in The Hague, Secretary General Mark Rutte said U.S. strikes on Iran did not violate international law. He urged Iran to meet its NPT obligations and accused Iran of aiding Russia in Ukraine by supplying kamikaze drones. Later that day, Iran launched a devastating missile strike on the U.S. El Udeid air base in Qatar after explosions over Doha. Qatar said its defenses intercepted the missiles, confirmed no casualties, and affirmed its right to respond. On June 23, President Trump announced a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, urging both sides to honor it and stressing the need for peace. The ceasefire took effect on June 24, with Trump insisting it will be permanent. As the conflict enters a new and uncertain phase, regional tensions remain high. With U.S. involvement and heavy losses on both sides, hopes for diplomacy have faded. The world watches with growing alarm, fearing a wider war with global repercussions.
That was Ronald Assas with a timeline, and now we move to a live press conference from the White House.
Because President Trump demanded it. This will be the most significant reinforcement of NATO's collective defense in the history of the NATO alliance. And as a result, the United States of America will carry less of the burden, and our NATO allies will be stronger than ever before. As NATO Secretary General Rutte put it, for too long, one ally, the United States, and our taxpayers, I may add, carried too much of the burden of that commitment. And that changes today. President Trump made this change possible. We will produce trillions more for our common defense to make us stronger and fairer by equalizing spending between America and our allies. This is the Trump effect. This is what the president meant when he declared that America is back. Now, back here at home, Americans are paying much cheaper prices for gasoline this summer, as both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times pointed out today. Here's how the Wall Street Journal put it. Hitting the road this summer won't bring as much of a big hit to your wallet. The national average for a gallon of regular gasoline is about 23 cents cheaper than this time last year. Analysts say plentiful supply is expected to keep prices down in the coming months. These are the cheapest gas prices at this point of the summer since 2021. And despite all the doomcasting from liberal pundits, oil prices on Tuesday were lower than before the Israel-Iran conflict began. As President Trump continues to unleash American energy, our country will have even more efficient, reliable, and affordable energy to protect our national security and fuel our people. Later this afternoon, here at the White House, the president will host a One Big Beautiful event in the East Room to rally Republicans to get the One Big Beautiful bill across the finish line. At that event, he will be joined by everyday Americans from across the country who will massively benefit from the common sense policies and provisions within this bill. This is the largest tax cut for working and middle-class Americans in history, and it's going to put more money into the pockets of hardworking Americans. Families will see an average increase in take-home pay of more than $10,000 per year. Americans earning between $30,000 and $80,000 per year will see a 15% tax cut. Overtime and tipped workers will save thousands of dollars annually. And our amazing seniors will receive historic financial relief by reducing the tax burden on their Social Security benefits. Simply put, this bill is going to unlock the golden age of America. And we look forward to continuing to work with the Senate and the House to see this bill on the president's desk for signature by Independence Day. Here in our new media seat today, we have Colin Anderson with the Washington Free Beacon, who will kick off our question and answer. Colin, go ahead.
Thank you, Caroline. We reported yesterday on a briefing from the Israeli defense minister in which she said the U.S. and Israel are working together to monitor any attempts from Iran to rebuild their nuclear program, and also that if Iran was to do so, the U.S. and Israel would work together to once again destroy that nuclear program. Does that align with the president's thinking?
Look, the president, as I said in those opening remarks, Colin, and thanks for being with us today, views the Middle East on its way to peace and prosperity. And the president used strength on Saturday night. The whole world saw that the United States is indeed the most lethal fighting force in the world with those precision strikes on Saturday evening. But the president wants peace. He always has. And right now we're on a diplomatic path with Iran. The president and his team, namely Special Envoy Witkoff, continue to be in communication with the Iranians and especially our Gulf and Arab partners in the region to come to an agreement with Iran. As for our alliance with the State of Israel and that friendship and that partnership between the United States and the State of Israel, I would argue it has never been stronger. And we see a new era in which perhaps some of these Gulf and Arab states can sign on to the Abraham Accords. That was one of the president's most signature accomplishments in his first term, and he'd like to see more of those countries sign on in this second term. And so we look forward to sustaining a long and durable peace in the region, and the president wants to do that through a diplomatic solution. But as he proved on Saturday night, he's not afraid to use strength if we need to do it. Gabe.
Thanks, Caroline. The president mentioned in a Truth Social post that no enriched uranium was moved from Fordo. What about the other two sites, Isfahan and Natanz, and how can the president be so sure that no uranium was moved?
Well, what I can assure you is that the United States and our intelligence agencies and Director Ratcliffe and the President's entire national security team were obviously watching these sites very closely in the weeks and the days leading up to the attack on Saturday, which I will add was one of the most secretive and successful operations in United States history. I think many of you in this room would agree with that because none of you in this room knew about the strike on Saturday until it took place. So we were watching closely, and there was no indication to the United States that any of that enriched uranium was moved prior to the strike.
From any of the sites?
Correct.
And then one more thing, Caroline. Next week, the president mentioned that there would be talks with Iran. Didn't mention any details, and Iran has not confirmed them. Can you share any details about any potential talks next week?
We don't have anything scheduled as of now, but I spoke to our Special Envoy Witkoff at length this morning, and I can assure all of you we continue to be in close communication with the Iranians and through our intermediaries as well, namely the Qataris, who have been an incredible ally and partner throughout this entire effort. And as I said, this administration is always focused on diplomacy and peace, and we want to ensure we can get to a place where Iran agrees to a non-enrichment civil nuclear program, and there are many other requests that the United States has. Those details continue to really, they're just starting. Of course, the operation was just on Saturday night, but we are in touch, and if there is a meeting, we will let you know as we always do. Brian.
Thank you, Caroline. Is two, one on trade. On the July deadlines coming up for the trade deals, is that deadline still hard and fast for the president, or is he now considering even coming to trade deals after that deadline, and where is he on that going forward?
I think the president has been asked this quite a few times by many of you in the media. I've heard him answer it at press conferences and at gaggles. He just spoke about it on Air Force One. The deadline is not critical. The president can simply provide these countries with a deal if they refuse to make us one by the deadline, and that means the president can pick a reciprocal tariff rate that he believes is advantageous for the United States and for the American worker, and he will continue to do that. But as for the deals, our United States Trade Ambassador, Jamison Greer, I speak to him frequently. He's working very hard, and he has had very good and productive discussions.
And that was part of the press conference at the White House by Karen Levitt, who talked about the success of the U.S.'s negotiation tactics when it comes to the NATO countries and discussed the budget of these countries, making it equal and fair. She also talked about gas prices in the United States going down, lower than it was in 2021. She also discussed what they called the, quote, big beautiful bill that will be hosting an event at the White House to discuss this bill and how this will help the U.S. economy and put money in the average American's pocket or save them money, calling it, quote, the golden age of America. She also says that President Trump views that the Middle East is on its way to peace and the diplomatic path to peace with Iran is quite on its way, with Witkoff taking lead when it comes to negotiations as well. And she also discussed the possibilities of the peace negotiations along with other Arab partners, and also talked about the Israeli ties with the Americans, calling it never stronger than it ever was at the current moment. Anyway, now we move on to Gaza. The Ministry of Health in Gaza has reported that 103 Palestinians were killed and 219 others wounded in the past 24 hours due to ongoing Israeli attacks. According to the ministry, the total death toll since the Israeli assault began on October 7, 2023 has now reached 56,259, with 132,458 others injured. The enclave remains under intense bombardment, with hospitals overwhelmed and humanitarian conditions continuing to deteriorate. Pope Leo has described Middle East conflict as raging with diabolical intensity and called for greater respect for international law. Speaking to Catholic bishops and aid agencies on Thursday, Pope Leo warned of unprecedented violence in the Middle East and described the situation in Gaza as tragic and inhumane. Without naming Israel, he urged more humanitarian access to the Palestinian enclave. The US-born Pope, who took office in May, also appealed for global powers to uphold international law following recent fighting involving Israel, Iran, and the United States. At least 15 people have been killed in an Israeli airstrike on a busy market in central Gaza. Health officials in Gaza say the strike targeted a crowded market in Deir el-Balah, leaving at least 15 dead and several others wounded. Victims were rushed to nearby hospitals on Thursday as families searched for missing relatives. The area had been busy with civilians at the time of the attack. The Israeli military has not yet commented on the incident. And to Russia, where they say it has seized more ground in Donetsk and foiled a terror plot near Moscow. The Russian Defense Ministry announced on Wednesday that its forces captured settlement of Yalta in Donetsk and struck Ukrainian military sites, including drone production facilities. It also claimed to have downed 335 Ukrainian drones within 24 hours. Separately, the FSB said it killed 2 suspects linked to Ukrainian intelligence in the Moscow region, alleging they were preparing explosives for an attack on Russian military personnel. China has rejected NATO's claim that it is aiding the war in Ukraine, calling them false and slanderous. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Gao Jiakun said Thursday that Beijing has not supplied weapons to any side in the Ukraine conflict. He accused NATO officials of distorting facts and attacking China's legitimate military development. The statement came in response to NATO chief Mark Rutte's warning over what he called a massive Chinese military buildup and support for Russia's war effort. NATO members also agreed to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP, following pressure from the US. Russia says Western arms and mercenaries in Ukraine are raising the risk of destabilization in Europe. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Bolsov warned that ongoing Western support to Ukraine, including weapons and foreign fighters, is escalating the threat to Europe's stability. He said Russia's forces are advancing successfully on the battlefield while accusing Kyiv of resorting to terrorist attacks. Bolsov added that Moscow remains open to a negotiated settlement despite the current escalation. Moving on to the economy, in the commodities sector, oil prices edged higher on Thursday as investors remained cautious about the Iran-Israel ceasefire and shifted their attention to market fundamentals after a stock draw in the United States. Brent crude futures were up 0.8% to $68.20 a barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude edged up 1% to $65.59 a barrel. Coal prices edged lower on Thursday, weighed down by easing geopolitical tensions in the Middle East and continued uncertainty over the Federal Reserve's interest rate trajectory. Spot gold fell 0.5% to $3,316.47 per ounce, while the U.S. gold futures slipped 0.4% to $3,329.20. That brings us to the end of our news bulletin. Here's what we've been covering. Iran's supreme leader warns future U.S. attack could trigger strikes on American bases in the Middle East. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth defends strikes on Iran, criticizes media coverage of nuclear raid intelligence. And Pope Leo describes Middle East conflict as raging with diabolical intensity, urges respect for international law. This brings us to the end of this news bulletin and our transmission for the day. But don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at Q News EGY to stay informed. Thank you for watching.